In the small town of Ansley, Michigan, USA, with only 25,000 residents, a crime occurred in a house at the end of a quiet street. For a long time, the police couldn't find a connection between the numerous clues, but an unexpected witness who accurately remembered the victim's last words helped solve the case. This is the story of how the police managed to solve a bloody murder and bring justice. Martin Duram was born in 1969 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He grew up with his siblings in a rural area where his parents owned a house. Martin was a normal child and lived in good circumstances, surrounded by natural beauty. It's not surprising that he enjoyed fishing and camping as a boy, often collecting photos. He often took a tent and camping backpack to spend a few days in the fresh air, usually accompanied by his older cousin with whom he formed a close relationship that lasted a lifetime. At the age of 17, Martin met his first love, Glenna Johnson. She was a year older and they lived in the same area and attended the same school. However, the love didn't last long and they quickly separated. But something kept them together, perhaps the glow of their first feelings. So, the lovers got back together, but separated again after a short time. It went on and on. They had many things in common, and the young people couldn't live without each other for long. Perhaps it was because they loved similar things and were passionate about the same things. Despite these similarities, the lovers finally decided to separate and go their separate ways in life. For a long time, the former lovers didn't see each other or communicate. In the meantime, Martin met another woman and immediately fell in love. It was Christina Keller. They got along right away and soon moved in together. After a short relationship, Martin decided that she was the one and that they should solidify their relationship. In 1990, Martin and the newlyweds moved into their own house, which they received from his parents. The apartment was located in a quiet bedroom neighborhood of the city. In the following years, they had 2 sons and a daughter. The wife took care of the house and the children while Martin worked and provided for the family. In addition to his main occupation as a car repairman, Martin worked part-time for many years in a small restaurant in the city. Nevertheless, the first years of marriage were quite difficult, especially because the children were born with a small age difference. The young parents had many concerns related to the care of the little ones. The couple slept little, were tired, and often started arguing, but they were determined to overcome all difficulties. Martin was a good father and did his best to raise his family. Many people considered him a role model. Unfortunately, this didn't save him from a tragedy. In March 1995, the family had an accident. A truck that ran a red light collided with Martin's car. The truck dragged his car across the asphalt and literally crumpled it, along with the driver. As a result of this traffic accident, Martin suffered serious injuries. His ribs, jaw, and legs were broken, and he suffered a severe head injury in which a large part of his brain was severely damaged. The doctors fought with all their might for Martin's life, but he fell into a coma in which he spent several months. During this time, he underwent multiple surgeries and recovered only with difficulty. But that's where his difficulties began. It took a long time for him to return to his usual way of life. Martin took a long time to learn how to sit up and hold his head up, not to mention more complex movements. He was literally forced to relearn his body. His face was disfigured by the accident, and his brain lost some of its functions. But Martin continued to fight to become himself again and return to a normal life and his family. Martin spent a long time in a wheelchair, then switched to crutches. Although he gradually came to terms with the consequences of the accident, this only happened on a physical level. Psychologically, he was broken. Martin could no longer work as a car mechanic, no longer support his family, and had a variety of physical limitations that turned his life upside down. The hardest blow for him was that he was no longer able to lead his usual mobile lifestyle. He loved camping, fishing, and hiking, but now he was confined to his bed and his home. Every movement was difficult and painful for Martin, and only the strongest painkillers could help him endure it. According to the doctors, These effects would haunt him for the rest of his life. But this time was difficult not only for Martin, who survived the accident, but also for his family. His wife, Christina, had previously only taken care of the children and the household, but now she also had the financial burden of life. She had to send her children to a daycare center and find a job to support her family. In addition, she had to take care of her sick husband. Fortunately, close relatives helped her with this. Thanks to their support, Christina was able to cope with all these difficulties. But those weren't all the problems. The husband became aggressive and often showed hostility and snapped at his wife. In addition, he suffered from memory lapses. Martin couldn't remember much from his past, including events in his family life. There were times when he couldn't remember his children's names. Many friends and acquaintances with whom he had been friends for decades became unfamiliar faces to him. Martin withdrew into isolation because he could no longer fully communicate with people due to massive memory lapses, concentration problems, and confusion in his head. All of this made him cold and aloof. Martin spent most of his time with his own thoughts, which he never told anyone about. At the same time, he tried to cure the consequences of his injuries. To this end, he constantly traveled to physiotherapy, sometimes stayed in the hospital for treatment, and changed several doctors. Fortunately, the first successes gradually began to appear. Martin's physical condition improved significantly, but the psychological consequences of the horror still haunted him. His wife painfully remembered this time and how difficult it must have been for Martin. He had always been very precise and meticulous, especially in financial matters. Now he couldn't even count his own money. At the same time, he constantly tried to influence the family's expenses by criticizing his wife's approach, which only increased the tension between the spouses. It was a very difficult time in the life of the young family. The head of the family continued to struggle with trauma and mental problems, but the inability to overcome some of them led him to a state of anger. He easily snapped at his wife, and almost always the anger was undeserved. Christina struggled to accept the changes in her husband's character, but gradually her patience ran out. 2 years after the accident, she filed for divorce. Later, Christina admitted that she didn't want to do this, but Martin became unbearable. The divorce was a heavy blow for Martin. He felt resentment and frustration for a long time because of his wife's decision. Martin moved out of the apartment to live with his parents. Nevertheless, he had to keep going. He wasn't used to standing still and twiddling his thumbs. Martin received a high payout from the insurance company for the accident, with which he could buy a property and afford another house. In addition, he received monthly payments from the agency as compensation for the accident, which were paid throughout his recovery. All of this allowed him to keep his head above water and make a living. Martin moved into his new home, along with his parrot. Christina loved this animal very much but left it to her ex-husband as a companion so that he wouldn't be bored and lonely. The bird was already quite old, but it supported Martin. The animal turned out to be a 15-year-old African gray parrot named Bud. So, Martin found himself in this modest company in a cottage in Ansley Lake, about 30 minutes from his old home. Martin had big plans. He wanted to recover as quickly as possible, get back on his feet, and return to a normal life for the sake of his children. Martin quickly settled into his new home. He communicated regularly with his children, and his relationship with his ex-wife improved. She realized that he was finally interested in life when he beautified the garden behind the house. Martin designed it himself. Apparently, he had a talent for it, which the neighbors in his area quickly noticed. Increasingly, he was commissioned to design private gardens and also to take care of lawns. So, Martin got a job, an additional income, and the confidence that he would cope with all life circumstances. All of this had a very positive effect on his condition. During this time, the doctors noted a steady improvement. Of course, they were gradual, but the dynamics were clearly positive. Despite the significant improvement in Martin's condition and mood, his ex-wife wasn't in a hurry to return to him. She feared that he would relax in this way and the problems would start again. So she observed from the outside, kept in touch with him, and brought the children. In 2004, Martin, who was tired of being alone, met his first love again. Coincidentally, Glenna Johnson had also just divorced her husband. They began to communicate with each other, and old feelings for each other flared up again with renewed energy. The former girlfriend visited Martin more and more often, and a romance began between the two. Later, Glenna moved in with Martin for good. Her children continued to live with their former husband, but he brought them to her regularly. Martin's children also came to visit occasionally. At such times, they had a very dynamic and busy life, but most of the time they were at home. This allowed the couple to pursue their favorite activities such as fishing, hunting, and camping. Glenna helped Martin in these times with his physical limitations, but it was difficult, and so they often went for walks in the neighborhood or visited the casino that they had loved in their youth. These visits became a small ritual. Once a month, they came here and tried their luck. The couple became popular in the local community. They met with friends and acquaintances for poker, hosted barbecues in the backyard, and generally formed a very harmonious unit. They seemed to have found each other again and were happy together. In the summer of 2005, they decided to get married. Everything seemed perfect, but the closest friends knew that something else was hidden behind the facade of this perfect relationship. It is known that Martin had changed after the accident, becoming stricter and more demanding. As a couple, he tried with all his might to control his lover, and he didn't like it at all when she did things without him or stayed alone. When she was traveling for business, Martin demanded complete control over the financial side of their relationship, which also caused some problems. His wife tried to manage the family affairs herself, but Martin suspected that she wasn't entirely honest in these matters. At that time, he continued to receive disability benefits, and the woman had child support payments agreed upon. But she had a weakness. Glenna was addicted to gambling and spent a lot of money on gambling. Glenna visited the casino much more often than her husband, was a regular there without his knowledge, and lost a lot of money. In addition, there were obviously problems between Glenna and his ex-wife, Christina. Apparently, Martin repeatedly complained to his ex-wife that she had abandoned him in a difficult time after the accident. He didn't consider that he had made Christina's life unbearable. His ex-wife tolerated him for 2 years and simply couldn't take it anymore. She left him but continued to support him. She socialized with him and brought the children with her. Martin, however, wasn't shy in his statements and spoke negatively about Christina to his new wife. These feelings were passed on to Glenna. It is known that she also didn't choose her expressions and often expressed her displeasure to her husband's children. Of course, they told their mother about it, and it went so far that the sons and the daughter no longer wanted to visit their father when his new wife was there. They didn't want to hear anything bad about their mother, and Christina supported their decision and no longer brought the children to their father. Martin was angry with his ex-wife and argued with her constantly. Against this background, there were also tensions with the children. In general, relationships deteriorated at this level, and the behavior of all those involved only worsened the situation. There is a small hint that could reveal the true attitude of Martin's second wife towards him. On the back of her hand was a tattoo with his name that she had gotten 18 years earlier when they were together. She never removed it, probably because of the strong feelings she had had over the years. She maintained her love for her first boyfriend all those 15 years and waited for the moment when they would be together again. However, the relationship of the family was anything but romantic. There were especially often arguments because of the money. This was because Martin suspected that his new wife was spending much more money and therefore accumulating debts. In order to cope with the financial difficulties, she repeatedly took money from her husband without his knowledge. Gradually, she took complete control over the finances of the family, which further exacerbated the situation. Glenna began to use checks from the insurance company that Martin received every month as pocket money. It was also known that Martin was taking strong medications that were only available with a prescription. It was known that the accident victim didn't take them regularly. He probably had a large amount of them left over. His wife also sold these medications on the side. The exact role of Martin in this activity remains unknown. It is possible that he had no objection to this sale. Later, opinions differed on this question. Some claimed that Martin himself had been running this small illegal business with the sale of painkillers from the beginning as he began to recover from the traffic accident. This allowed him an additional income that he urgently needed when he was unemployed. However, there were also opponents of this theory who claimed that Glenna simply took the remaining medications without his knowledge and sold them without her husband's knowledge. Despite all these pitfalls, the toxic relationship of the partners lasted more than 11 years. In 2015, they behaved amicably, were still together, but could no longer hide that the marriage had cracks. From time to time, the dissatisfaction broke out in scandals that became more and more frequent. Later, a family friend said he had witnessed an argument in which Martin threatened to kill his wife. Most of the time, however, they continued to play the role of the perfect couple, walking together and holding hands as at the beginning of their relationship in their youth. But in May 2015, the question of dissolving the marriage came up seriously. One morning in May 2015, the ex-wife Christina learned that Martin wanted to sell his house. Christina found the ad on an auction website. She was very surprised and immediately called Martin. She asked him why he had suddenly decided to get rid of his property and put it up for auction, since he loved his new home so much, in which he had created his own garden and lovingly designed it. Martin had no intention of selling anything, so he asked his wife about it. Glenna said it must be a mistake and she would sort things out, but it turned out that she never brought up the matter again after leaving the ad for the house on the website. Previously, the couple's car had been seized due to debt. Here, too, Glenna assured her husband that it was a mistake and she would sort things out, but ultimately nothing changed. The auction of the house was scheduled for 3 weeks, towards the end of the month. It was probably due to the many debts that she had made during the marriage. Glenna wanted to auction off the house to pay off her debts, but Martin didn't want to tell her about it. She kept this information secret from everyone. On May 13, 2015, one of Martin's neighbors came to his house early in the morning and knocked to discuss a few worldly things with the homeowner. He was surprised that no one responded to his visit or opened the door, even though Martin was usually always awake around this time. The door of the house was open. The neighbor went inside and called Martin and his wife, but no one answered. The uninvited guest went a little further and realized why the door wasn't open for him when he reached the couple's bedroom. Here, the head of the family lay on the floor in a pool of his own blood, and next to him lay his wife, 47-year-old Glenna, with severe bleeding from the head. The neighbor got scared because he thought the perpetrator might be somewhere nearby, ran out of the house, and immediately called 911. When the paramedics arrived at the scene, they found that nothing more could be done to help Martin. He lay on his side, wearing only his underwear, and his body was already cold. The paramedics determined the death of 46-year-old Martin, who had died several hours before the emergency call. His wife, however, was still alive, was even conscious, and tried to say something. She made incoherent noises that no one understood. The woman lay fully clothed next to her husband. Glenna was unable to provide any useful information about what had happened. She was immediately taken to the hospital and given medical care. At the same time, the investigators began their investigations. It turned out that the bullet had pierced Glenna's skull and was on a trajectory that didn't affect her brain, so she wasn't seriously injured. The survivor recovered quickly after the operation in the clinic. Soon the investigators were able to visit her to question her about the incident. But while the woman was in treatment, they had too much other work to do. The investigators tried to reconstruct the chronology of the events by examining the crime scene. In general, it didn't look like a robbery, since no valuables and personal belongings of the Durams were missing. Even the money remained in a clearly visible place and wasn't touched by the perpetrator. In addition, neither doors nor windows were broken, which means that the victims of the attack may have known the intruder and let him in themselves. During this time, the police learned that Martin was taking strong painkillers and dealing with them. It was then assumed that these were the cause of the attack. His whole plan to sell the drugs was uncovered. The investigators suspected that there had been a conflict with the buyers during the handover. At this time, however, the forensic technicians had already examined and analyzed the crime scene, including the bullets found in the house and the weapon. The weapon was later examined and turned out to be the murder weapon. In fact, the weapon had belonged to Martin Duram himself for years, but it was the weapon with which the two had been shot. It turned out that the intruder had to first break into the house, take the weapon, i.e. know where it was located, then take exactly the right ammunition, load it, and only then start shooting. This scheme looked too complicated and therefore seemed implausible. In addition, during a more thorough search of the bathroom, Martin's painkillers were found that hadn't been stolen from the house, so the possibility of the sale and the attack on the buyers of the drugs was eliminated. The weapon with which Martin was killed was found under the sofa in the living room. There was generally too much blood here, which didn't fit the place where the body was found. Obviously, there was also an attack, a shooting in the living room, and then the execution was continued in the bedroom. Martin could have been shot in the living room and the body then taken away, but why should he do that? One had the feeling that this was done for a specific reason, probably to stage the crime and confuse the investigation. This assumption was confirmed when a cartridge case was also found in the living room. This meant that the shooting had taken place there after all. The further the investigation progressed, the more questions arose. Blood from different rooms was sent for examination, which yielded unexpected results. With the help of the analysis, it was determined that all the shots at Martin were actually fired in the bedroom. His blood wasn't in the living room, and there were also no traces that indicated a dragging of the body. And the blood in the living room belonged exclusively to Glenna, who, however, was found in the bedroom. The bullet, the casing of which was found in the living room, had hit the woman's head, which supports this assumption. But how could she get to the bedroom after this wound? Medical experts explained to the police that this could actually have been the case, since the woman's wound was much less severe than expected. She could have made it to the bedroom on her own, especially since she was conscious when she was discovered. Nevertheless, the whole thing seemed strange. From then on, the police suspected that the victim's wife opened fire, shot her husband, and then wounded herself to remove suspicion from herself. However, physical evidence was required for all these hypotheses. At this time, the police officers couldn't yet question the survivor. She was in treatment and recovering in the hospital, and therefore took her cell phone with them for review. In this way, the investigators learned that the family was in a severe financial crisis. Just the day before her husband's death, she had actively searched for descriptions and uses of a Luger .07 pistol, the same pistol with which her husband was killed, and she was shot in the head. The police found 2 farewell letters in the house in which Glenna apologized to her children for what she was about to do. In addition, she said goodbye to everyone as she planned to take her own life. All this indicated that she was the perpetrator of the crime. There were no fingerprints on the weapon, neither hers nor those of her husband. It had been thoroughly wiped down by the perpetrator. Based on all the facts gathered, the investigators reconstructed the picture. Something forced her to shoot her husband first. He was first killed in the bedroom, and then the woman shot herself in the head but in the living room. In contrast to Martin, however, she wasn't dead immediately, so she managed to get into the marital bedroom. All this could be confirmed or refuted by a conversation with the survivor, so the police waited to talk to her. In addition, they continued to look for evidence. At this time, the victim's family was already certain that it wasn't a stranger who had attacked them, but that Martin's wife had committed the crime herself. Christina Keller, the ex-wife of the murdered man, was shocked by what had happened. Although she had never had a high opinion of Glenna, especially because of her aggressive behavior, she never thought that she would resort to a weapon. In any case, Christina took her old parrot home to her children. Meanwhile, the investigators were able to speak with Glenna for the first time. She was doing well. The doctors confirmed that she knew what was happening around her and that she was ready to listen to the investigators. Despite the positive assessment of the doctors, she reacted evasively to the questions of the investigators. According to her statements, Glenna had never written a farewell letter and had no intention of killing herself or even her husband. The police officers were concerned about the fact that Glenna strictly denied any involvement in the attack on her husband, but claimed that she couldn't remember the events of that tragic day. This discrepancy appeared suspicious and indicated the possible perpetrator, but nothing could be done at this time. There was no clear evidence against her. It took a few more months until she was released, and the woman could go home. The investigators still didn't have enough evidence, and the police also feared that Glenna's complete denial of guilt and trauma would convince the jurors of her innocence. The confirmation of the bloody suspicion came from a completely unexpected source. One night, Christina was awakened by a talking parrot on the ground floor. The woman went down to see the bird and was so shocked by what it said that she decided to record the parrot's monologue on video. She took out her cell phone and began filming. The bird kept saying the same thing, "Don't shoot, Glenna," while repeating the voice of its dead owner. This triggered a shock and horror, and for some time afterwards the woman was even haunted by nightmares. She immediately called the police and told them about it. Later, she showed them the video. Of course, the bird couldn't appear as a witness during the trial, but from that moment on, all the investigators' doubts about the involvement of the woman who had survived the headshot were dispelled. The new details of the case aroused the interest of the public and the media in the story. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. The case came to light again later in June 2016 when the police arrested Glenn Duram. For months before the incident, the investigators had pieced together the evidence in this case. They had created a convincing picture that would clearly prove to the jurors who the murderer was and restore justice to the Duram family. It had originally been assumed that the incriminating pet video wouldn't be used because it would have been too provocative, and it wasn't known how the jurors would perceive it. The prosecutor argued that Glenna was in a difficult financial situation. She couldn't confess her gambling defaults to her husband. Over a longer period before the murder, the defendant had not paid her bills because she used all the money for debts that she had accumulated due to her gambling addiction. When she finally decided to take her own life, she wrote 2 letters, one to her husband and one to her children. This shows that Glenna originally had no intention of executing her lover, but something went wrong. The last straw was the unsuccessful sale of the family home that was auctioned off without her husband's knowledge. When Martin learned of this from Christina, he probably began to put pressure on his wife. There could have been a scandal, and so she decided to kill her husband in a fit of anger before turning the weapon on herself. But Glenna and her lawyer emphasized that she can't remember anything, neither the shooting nor the letters. The defendant claimed that she loved her husband so much that she could never have killed him. She said that a whole list of medications that she was taking to restore her cognitive functions was presented as evidence of her poor condition. The defendant denied searching her phone for weapons, as she supposedly only used it for games and calls. The trial lasted 10 days. The prosecution believed that they had put together a solid case that would convince the jurors. At some point, however, it seemed that the jurors doubted due to insufficient circumstantial evidence. Then a video recording of the parrot's words was shown as a decisive argument. Experts spoke out and explained that parrots have a very strong bond with their owners and mimic the people around them. Most experts agreed that Martin's last words made a strong impression on the bird and were imprinted in the parrot's memory so that he repeated them constantly. The result was that after 8 hours of deliberations, the jurors found 49-year-old Glenna Duram guilty. Of course, the parrot didn't solve the crime, but it became an important argument for justice in its time. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.